Hi everyone, my name is Allison Tiemann, and here is another low effort video discussion. This time the topic is the CHAZ zone, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and their approach to community self-policing. So if you don't know, CHAZ was created in Seattle. It's I think a 6 block area of Seattle. It was created by presumably anarchists, maybe Black Lives Matter, it's a little bit hazy, but it was created as an experiment in removing police presence. Actually, what I think happened for real is that the protesters intimidated the police, or the police just decided to withdraw from the precinct that was in the area as a tactic to reduce tensions. So now this complete area has no first responders, no police in it, and all of the policing is done by the people within the zone. And I thought I would discuss this because I've been talking to some of the proponents of CHAZ, and as an anarchist myself, I'm not necessarily against the concept of a community self-policing, or a community taking on it upon itself to do its own policing. In theory, I'm not opposed to the concept. I'm sort of sympathetic with the idea of wanting to try it out, wanting to see if it works. I'm not confident in this group of people actually creating something coherent and workable, but I'm sympathetic to the desire to actually do it. So I thought, well, let's look at this. Let's look at it. Let's look at the approach that they're taking. Let's analyze it. And one of the reasons why I'm not particularly confident in these individuals is because while I see a lot of criticism of current policing and current society, our cishet, patriarchal, white supremacist society, I don't see a lot of introspection on how society works or human nature, or looking at how our society actually gets things right. So while they have perhaps legitimate criticisms of society, they don't seem to go any further than that. And if you don't go any further than that, you tear down the structures of society, what ends up happening is you get to the point of what's next. How do we build something up now? We've torn it all down. We're in a void. We have anarchy. How do we build something new? How do we make this work? And I wanted to talk about this in the context of this self-policing, because of course it's in response to the allegations of police brutality throughout the United States and now Canada and the Western world in general, because God knows the Western world is the part of the world with the greatest problem with police brutality. But setting that aside, setting my skepticism about that aside, this all started because of alleged police brutality. Now, one thing I want to mention about the alleged police brutality is, well, whether or not you think this is acceptable, the police have a mandate to engage in violence in the pursuit of public security, the protection of people's property and persons. So they've been given authority to be violent, or to meet violence with violence, and take whatever violent actions there are to end violence. So one of the things that I'm having a little bit of an issue with when people present things as police brutality is that they seem to not understand this concept. When you use violence to end or to resolve a conflict, that means you, by definition, in being able to resolve that conflict using violence, will be using more violence than the person that initially initiated the violence with the police or with another citizen. So that's how it works. It's logical, right? You using violence to end the situation, to resolve the situation, you're going to end up using a greater degree of violence in order to end it than the person who initiated the violence. It's just the way it works. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that a lot of this seems to be a misunderstanding with that. I mean, yes, police are going to be violent because that's how, in some cases, that's part of their arsenal of resolving problems. And okay, so that's fine. You can say, well, should a society have a group of people who are mandated to use violence to resolve the violence of others, of the citizens within that society? That's a fine conversation to have. Let's have that conversation. But the problem here that I'm seeing with CHAZ is, allegedly, I'm going to say allegedly because this might just be a rumor, but allegedly they're having an issue with a particular individual who is robbing people with a machete. So we're talking about a significant amount of violence. Like, knife violence is pretty gruesome. You know, you can die quicker from a knife wound than certain forms of being shot. So knives are not just, they're pretty serious. This is a pretty serious form of violence. Threatening people with machete, very serious form of violence. So the problem, and again, this is a rumor, so I don't know for sure, but this does pose, this situation, even if it's a rumor, does pose a problem for the CHAZ model. So this individual says, moron for America, take it with a grain of salt. We just had a robbery with a machete out here. Not very many peaceful solutions to that. By the way, mental health is a silent, ignored elephant. Now, I don't know if this individual is within the CHAZ zone. I don't know if they're reporting on the CHAZ zone or if they're just proposing a thought experiment. I do know that there has been thefts in the CHAZ zone. There has been assaults in the CHAZ zone. There has been violence in the CHAZ zones. There has been one individual who did a interview with Daily Caller, said that there were shots going on, and he was also concerned about the violence that he was hearing and the screams of terror. But regardless, what I'm looking at is the hypothetical. Let's put out the hypothetical. We have a man stealing from people, or a woman, let's be gender neutral here, stealing from people at machete point. How do you resolve that in the CHAZ zone without appealing to the police, who have been appointed and trained to use violence to resolve violent situations like this? This man has initiated violence with presumably unarmed people. Now we need to resolve it. And inevitably, something like this is going to end up needing violence to resolve it, unless, I don't know, unless you can hypnotize him or talk him down, but usually, at some point there is going to be a point where the machete-wielding maniac is not going to be talked down, and he can't be hypnotized, and you can't give him a hug without him cutting you open like a ripe papaya. There is going to be an incident which can only be resolved through violence. Now, what do you do? Well, in the CHAZ situation, apparently they're replacing police with untrained volunteers who are not elected. They're just volunteers. So they appoint themselves to the position of arbiters of violence in the CHAZ community. And I'm guessing that nobody can say no, because there's no system to hold them accountable. There's no system to vote them out. I think there is more community oversight over the police than there is in this situation. So we got these armed people coming in to provide security for CHAZ with no oversight, no ability to vote them out, and there's no accountability, and they aren't trained. And I'm thinking, so if we authorize them to use violence the way we authorize police, it seems like this is going to be this is going to end badly. Like, it's most likely. And how do you prevent sociopaths from getting into your volunteer armed community police force and engaging in aggressive actions? And if they do you then do a Black Lives Matter squared to get rid of them? Like, it seems like it's just a difficult question to answer, and I don't think that a volunteer security force, an armed volunteer security force, is necessarily the answer here. But like I said, I'm not putting this out because I don't have sympathy for the desire to pursue a anarchistic question, shall we say. I do have sympathy for that, but at the same time, don't you have to be a little bit more concerned? Like, you don't just sort of blob out and just do whatever. You got to give some thought to this, and you got to give oversight to the people who are armed. You have to have some sort of judiciary to make sure that they're doing their job, or some training. Like, I'm not sure how going from the police who are trained to a bunch of volunteers who are untrained is a step forward. We're just going to presume they have your best interests in mind. But let's set that aside. Now, another proposal is that they replace police not with an armed vigilantes, but with community intervention models that focus on, I guess, mental health. Let's see. This is et e girl t girl et girl. Well, that's very clever. That's cute. At Lorem Getsum, she says, ignored, not at all. So this is in response to the man who alleges that there's a machete wielding thief in the CHAZ zone. This is exactly why people want the police who respond to mental health instability with anger, violence, and bullets. Okay, I'm just going to pause here for a second. Mental health instability. Could it be possible that this man is a thief or an armed robber who wants stuff and isn't actually dealing with mental health instability outside of antisocial personality disorder? Like, is that possible? Anyway, can you continue? Why people want the police who respond to mental health instability with anger, violence, and bullets to be replaced by a more comprehensive public safety system that would include a well-trained and highly capable mental health professionals. Oh my holy God. Okay, all right, let's unpack this. Just the first thing that came to mind is I try to help people. Let me reframe this so it's a little less doofus. And I know there's a lot of grain and it's really crazy, but okay. I try to help people with their mental health issues. I know that I'm mostly just, I guess, at best a life coach. I'm not a registered psychotherapist, just prescribe drugs. I'm not a registered clinical psychologist. I just have a lot of experience overcoming things like anxiety and depression and productivity issues. So I try to help people with their mental health. I can only imagine if on top of that, I put myself in the shoes of a psychologist, okay? I can only imagine as a psychologist, if you're not just asked to deal with a patient or somebody who wants to improve their mental health and very willingly, they've sought you out. They're sitting on your couch. They're opening their heart to you. You're sifting through the id and you're putting all the pieces of puzzle and you're trying to, but they're there willingly, and that's what you've signed up for. But now you got to go confront the machete wielding man. And I mean, this could be a situation where he's killed a bunch of people, and you're like, you're going to use the powers of psychology to go and resolve this violent situation. I don't know if I would, if I had the credentials, I'm not so sure I would sign up for such a thing, such an endeavor. I think that, and that this is can't we have some specialization here? The psychologists deal with the people who are ready to touch upon really dark parts of their psyche, who aren't, as a result of that, going to end up in a park threatening people with a machete. They come willingly. They have some control over themselves. And then we can have some other group of people deal with the machete wielding thief or armed robber in the garden. Is there room for specialization in all of this? Can we have a psychologist and a secure? I don't know. Anyway, I just think that's a huge ask, for just psychologists to also be able to resolve situations of immediate peril to their lives. That sounds like an 80s that sounds like an 80s sitcom in the making. He's a psychologist and a hostage negotiator and a police officer and a lawyer. So we can't have specialization here, Oh man, and the other thing is the assumption is that a guy who is stealing things from people at machete point is going to be open to a social worker talking about his mom. That he's going to be in that headspace as he's stealing. Oh man, I can just imagine that. It's just He's just going after person after person after person, and they're like, "Oh, but come have some group therapy. Come to the group circle. We'll do some confessions. Let's like get you in the squeezy tube so you can have a rebirth experience." Like, oh, a more comprehensive public safety system that would include well trained and highly capable mental health professionals. Seriously, do you have to send the mental health professionals after the armed maniacs? I don't think you're going to have many mental health professionals. I mean, I have never met a mental health professional who could also do that. Wrestled the armed maniac to the ground. I mean, maybe like judo or jiu-jitsu coaches who also, help people with their issues as well. But still, this is a very very political answer. But I figured, let's unpack it. All right. And this was my response to this. If you're not talking about the immediate situation, because the immediate situation, if somebody's stealing from people, if someone's holding them up with a machete, they're an armed robber, and they're actually threatening people's lives to get their stuff. That is not the point in time where you send psychologists after this person, or group counselors, or any sort of therapist, because they're not going to be open to it, I think. They're just not going to be in that headspace. So that's not the time. So I was giving her the benefit of the doubt, and I was assuming that, okay, the intervention comes before they're holding up denizens of CHAZ with a machete. It comes well before. Okay, well before. So this was my response. Unless you're ready to revamp your mental health system, recognize that quote unquote male violence comes from genetic issues plus abuse, not quote unquote toxic masculinity, and create services geared for men based on men's actual experiences, you will have to be able to meet violence with violence. And that's the honest truth. I mean, this CHAZ experiment came out as an experiment of getting rid of the police, because the police use violence, they meet violence with violence. And when you do that, there are going to be mistakes, guaranteed. So the only way to not have the police is to not need the police. And the only way to do that is to develop mental health interventions. And we're talking about men because men are the majority of the violent offenders. So we got to look at that. If you want to get rid of most of the crime, I know people who talk about this don't even recognize women's crime. And they don't recognize the sentencing disparities, so they don't realize that women's crime is probably a lot bigger than we actually think it is. Because they tend to be not sentenced at the same rate as men, they tend to be not arrested at the same rate as men. So it's total undercount of women's crime. But let's set that aside. Let's just look at men's crime and why men do crime. We would have to develop a system of interventions that are informed by actual science, actual empirical evidence, not feminist ideology or conjecture about men. We couldn't just say, well, male violence is a part of patriarchy and male ideology and toxic masculinity, because that's not the case. Toxic masculinity, in fact, what they refer to as masculine ideology, or adherence to masculine ideology, or actually what they call stereotype threat, or the feeling like you are not able to adhere to masculinity, so you're not able to be masculine. That is the only thing that they have seen with any sort of correlation to violence, and it's inconsistent. So men with a moderate feeling of, in this case it was a worry about being seen as homosexual or effeminate, men with a moderate fear of that are actually less violent towards women. Men with a high fear of that are more violent, and men with a low fear of that are more violent. So it's a weird sort of you thing going on, not a really clear correlation between that specific effect and violence. And toxic masculinity, what feminists call toxic masculinity, you need to nail them to the wall with this one. You need to ask them, how much does toxic masculinity, or what you refer to as toxic masculinity, explain the variation in violence and criminal violence? And you just have to say it that way, because it forces them to treat toxic masculinity as separate the effect separate from the cause. So the cause is separate from the effect, because they'll bundle them together and say that they'll say toxic masculinity is violent criminality, and then they'll say, well, toxic masculinity has 100% correlation with violent criminality, herp to derp to derp, and they did that just because they're playing with definitions. You got to separate the two. Toxic masculinity has to be defined in such a way as it could be considered causal to criminal violence, so you can find out how much criminal violence is explained through toxic masculinity. Well, the amount that even gender role fear, which is what they were referring to, what they usually look at, the amount is something like maybe 14%. I think my cat is trapped in my sofa. What are you doing? Get out of there! Don't scratch the sofa. Okay, sorry. So gender role stress, or the fear that you aren't living up to your gender role, accounts for, and inconsistently, about 14% of violence or increase in violence. And the genetic factors like antisocial personality disorder account for something like 50, in previous studies 50%, and now later studies are finding that it counts possibly for like well over 90%. So the causal factors for violence in men, it's not 100%, because there are men with antisocial personality disorder that aren't violent at all, because there's another factor: antisocial personality disorder plus abuse. And we haven't done a heck of a lot of studies on it, but it's looking like those two things account for the majority of male violence. And since you can't really do anything about genetic factors unless we live in a dystopia where you can select your child from a menu, you're left with abuse. So in order to reduce the likelihood that you're going to have a machete-wielding thief in your CHAZ zone, you're going to have to start recognizing the abuse of boys and men. And you're going to have to start creating interventions to help men and boys. And you can't do this if you are pinning male violence on the patriarchy or toxic masculinity or bullshit like that. You'd have to look at what it actually is a result of and deal with actual men's issues if you really want to create a world in which you don't need to use violence. You don't need to meet violence with violence, because the violence doesn't exist in the first place. And this is what I said. And it's just like, it's so funny, because if you really do want this kind of a world, if you want a CHAZ zone without machete-wielding robbers, without abused men with genetic antisocial personality disorder, so genetic factors plus abuse, if you want a world in which you don't have to deal with them, then you got to start recognizing the abuse of boys and men. You got to start recognizing and dealing with it and giving men social service, men and boys social services when they're abused. You got to actually recognize a men's issue. Otherwise, you're just going to have to live with the police. Because eventually CHAZ is going to be up against this problem. If you don't, and first of all, this problem's there because we don't have those systems in place. We don't have an honest understanding of where male violence comes from, because we tag it to because feminists want to use the existence of male violence to make all men guilty. They want to use the existence of male violence as a social tool. So we don't actually look at it honestly. We don't look at why or what we could do to end it. And so those systems don't exist. So CHAZ is going to have to face that question. CHAZ is doomed before it even starts, because the violence is already there. We don't have the social system to help boys who are abused. We barely even care about them. We'd rather just throw them in prison or let the police beat it out of them. I totally agree. This is a bad situation. But it's bad because we don't care about boys. And the only way to change it, the only way to create a society where you don't have to meet violence with violence, which means you're going to have some sort of police, some sort of type of police, just inevitably. Otherwise, you're going to have to deal with the machete-wielding robbers and rapists. You're going to have some kind of police, and there's going to be problems, because once you're meeting violence with violence, the police will overshoot. There will be issues. They will make mistakes, guaranteed. So the only way you can create a society where you don't meet violence with violence is with men's issues. All roads lead to Rome. All right, that's it for me and my low quality stream. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to support Honey Badger Radio, feedthebadger.com. You also support me as well there. So, and if you like this content, I guess like, because I think that does something with the algorithm. I don't know. It confuses the hell out of me. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll try to answer your questions. And I hope you like the return of the low effort streams. See you later. And thank you for your kind attention.